Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 6, the final unit in our Lunch and Learn series, and I hope you've had an opportunity to get some good knowledge and maybe reinforce some things that you've already knew as a leader and have actually been able to apply them in the workplace. So today the focus is very much on meetings and how to facilitate effective meetings. And you might ask the question, well, why do we need to do a module or a unit on meetings? Well, I think our whole life is a meeting, and frankly, this is a meeting, and as soon as you finish here, there's probably another meeting. And I think it's very important that leaders learn to run constructive, productive, and collaborative meetings, and that's essentially what this unit is about. So it's all about, and of course, all of us attend lots and lots of meetings, let's face it. And let's be honest about it, most of the meetings that we attend are dull, and boring and unproductive, and often we can assume that they're just a waste of time. So I think being a good leader partly is about being able to facilitate good meetings. So I'm hoping that I can share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way about running an effective meeting. Could I just make sure that I'm being heard loud and clear? So just over in the question box, if you could just type in clear, that would be great, guys. That will give me an indication that I'm coming across loud and clear and not talking to myself. Yep, great. Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Excellent. All right. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. That's great. All right. So let's get underway. And let's just recap on the journey that we've been on and where we've come from. You will recall way back, actually, in July, we started looking at the ingredients of effective feedback. And the whole idea there was to talk about the importance of feedback and the need for you to be giving regular feedback every single day. I hope that you've been able to continue to do that, because it's really important that all of these units build upon each other, so we don't just drop one and decide to do the next thing. So just a reminder, gentle reminder, if you're not giving regular feedback or you've fallen back into old habits, well, this afternoon you can start by giving feedback. And feedback, of course, doesn't have to be negative. It can be quite positive. In Unit 2, I got you to complete the influencing capabilities profile, and essentially what that was about is to help you improve your capacity to influence those people around you. The people around you are those people who work with you, your boss, and of course all the stakeholders that you might work with inside and outside the organisation. And then in Unit 3 we looked at optimising team performance, and essentially what I was getting at there was the fact that the only real way that you can optimize team performance is by basically having good conversations with the people that you work with. And essentially what Unit 3 was about was having good conversations. I shared with you the 5 conversations framework, and I'm not suggesting that you need to use that, but it was just a framework that you might like to apply. And of course, I'm always open to feedback about how you're going with these sorts of things. In Unit 4, we looked at getting the best out of people, and my argument there was that your job essentially is about getting the very best out of the people that you lead. Now, getting the best out of the people you lead doesn't necessarily mean trying to improve their productivity by 100%, although that'd be nice, wouldn't it? It's really about getting maybe a 10% improvement, and if there are 5 people reporting to you and you're getting a 10% improvement in each, exponentially that's going to make a significant difference in terms of the overall productivity for you. In Module 5, we looked at understanding, which was the last one, understanding people and their personalities. And I guess it was based on the Platinum Rule about treating people how they want to be treated, rather than treating people how you want to be treated. And I'm hoping that you've had a chance to look around the workplace, understand the people that you work with, and be able to tailor your communication message to meet and suit their particular personality. We used 4 animals there: owls, peacocks, lambs and bulls, and got you to complete the diagnostic. And today, of course, we're going to be looking at meetings and how to run effective meetings. So let's get underway. So your homework, of course, was to attempt to deal with people in a slightly different manner and try to appreciate and understand what their personality is and try to tailor your message for their needs. So I hope you've had the opportunity to do that. Now, it's based on the golden rule. It's based on the platinum rule, actually, because the golden rule is treat people how they want to be treated. Sorry, the golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated. And the platinum rule is treat people how they want to be treated, which is essentially what I was getting at in Module 5. So, guys, I'm hoping you had a good opportunity to try that and have a bit of fun with it and consider some different ways, perhaps, for communication. Now, what are we covering today? Well, in this short, sharp hour, we're going to look at the contexts of meetings. We're going to look at the structures of meetings. We're going to look at a couple of interpersonal skills that will be useful for you in the meeting forums. So what sort of things can you try? And finally, we're going to look at some ideas that might enrich your team meetings that are very practical. I know they work really well, and I'll share them with you. Right, so let's consider this for a moment. Getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical and untapped skills of any leader, in my view. Because if you're a supervisor or a leader, which I dare say you are, you're probably running meetings. And when you think about the exercise of running meetings, it's quite costly. What do I mean by that? Well, you get 5 people sitting in a room together, plus yourself. We're talking 6 people times their hourly rate, plus the fact that those 6 people can't attend to other things such as customers during the time. That becomes quite a costly exercise. Doesn't show up in the balance sheet, and I think sometimes we neglect to consider the costs of meetings. So obviously, if you become very good at running productive meetings, then you are utilising that cost far more effectively. And that's pretty much what we're trying to cover here in this unit. Okay, and at any time during the broadcast, as normal, please type in your question in the question box or comment. I'm going to take those as we go through the presentation today. All right, so I want you to consider for a moment this issue. That meetings themselves are not productive. It's actually what happens or doesn't happen between meetings that determines how effective the meeting is. So when we meet, nothing actually happens other than the allocation of resources, who's going to do what, perhaps reports and feedback on the reports. A whole lot of information is shared in a meeting, and what happens is that we have a number of outcomes that come out of meetings. Now, whether those outcomes are being met or not is very much the measure of whether the meeting's been effective. So you can have a very effective meeting, and that would be measured by the amount of behaviour change that's occurred as a result of the meeting. You can also have a very ineffective meeting where nothing has happened after the meeting, and we've all been in meetings where that's occurred. So we want to make sure that what happens between meetings justifies the fact that we are downing tools to meet in the first place. So I just want you to think about that for a moment. Now, when you and I have meetings, there are a range of reasons for us to have meetings. And if you think about it, and of course some of these are, of course, are mixed in together. But if you think about it, meetings can be there to inform people. So in other words, if you've got a speaker or something, or you've got a certain expertise in a particular technical area, and you might be sharing that with the people in the meeting, well, obviously that's about informing people. Or if there's a new procedure in place, it might be you explaining to people what that new procedure is. So obviously you're informing the participants in the meeting. It can also be about educating people, so, a little bit different, whereas information is about, announcements. Education is more around giving people a new skill set. So obviously the meeting that we're doing today is very much around educating rather than informing. Of course, there's a bit of information as well. Meetings are also there to clarify positions. So often what happens is that it's an opportunity for you and for me to make it very clear that our perspective on a situation is such and such, and that we're on the same, we're on the same wavelength as the participants in the meeting. So it can be about clarifying situations. Meetings can also be about engaging people as well. So it might be about engaging people in the decision-making process. So you're actually wanting people to give input into a decision, to consider a particular problem and how we might resolve that. So that becomes an issue around engaging. It could be about, and this isn't dissimilar, solving collective problems. So we might have a meeting, for example, about a particular customer or something that might have gone wrong. It's normally when we meet about those things. And we might have a meeting around how we might resolve that problem so that the customer's happy and you're happy and everybody knows what they need to do. So we've got problem-solving meetings. We've also got meetings where we review. So this might be where people actually give reports or work in progress report. This is what I've been doing for the last week or the last 2 weeks, and each member of the team gives a report so that it keeps everyone else abreast of what's going on, plus of course yourself. And of course there are many weekly and fortnightly meetings that fit that bill. And of course meetings are there to make decisions, so you can actually sound people out and ask them for their opinion, and based on the opinions around the table you can then make an informed decision once you've canvassed everybody's opinions and feedback. So of course some of those reasons they would resonate with you because you'd use them fairly regularly. Other ones you might like to think about. Okay, all right, so moving right along, I mentioned at the outset that meetings are costly. So I want you to have a think about this for a moment, because I think sometimes when people think, I say things like a meeting is a costly exercise, it sort of goes, straight over the top of their head. But actually have a think about this and calculate this for yourself. So let's have a look at this. Let's consider, for example, and this will be coming up on your screen shortly. Whoop, it's gone again. Taking some time to come up by the look of it. Okay, now we're there. So let's consider these questions. What's the average income in your team on an hourly basis? It's pretty easy to work out. So you could actually calculate this yourself. So what do people get paid on an hourly basis? All right, that's the first interesting question. The second question is, how many meetings on average do your team members attend per week? You could probably work that out fairly easily, and they're not just meetings that involve you. They could be other meetings that they're involved in. Of course, you can do an audit on this as well and just ask people to keep a diary note of the number of meetings that they have actually attended during the week. Actually, you'll be quite surprised at the amount of time that people spend in meetings when you do this. Then you ask the question, how long is the typical meeting? And we like to stick to an hourly schedule. Of course, that's what we're doing in the Lunch and Learn. And some meetings, of course, go for a lot longer, and very few go for shorter than an hour. So if we work on, how long are these meetings on average? So then you ask the question, how many people are in my team? And then what you do is you multiply all of those costs, because these are what we call opportunity costs. Because, as I said before, when people are sitting in a meeting, they're generally not doing anything else other than participating, or perhaps even not participating in the meeting. So they're not attending to customer requests, they're not completing reports, They're not completing checking emails necessarily. So of course, what it means is that the cost of the meeting, so if you spend an hour in a meeting, it's actually costing you 2 hours. Why? Well, an hour for the meeting, but also another hour for the opportunity costs that are lost because you couldn't spend that hour doing something else. So let's have a look at a practical example of this. Let's say that the average income of your team on an hourly rate is $31.25 per hour. All right, let's say the average person earns that amount per hour when you extrapolate their hourly rate across the year. And let's just say that the average number of meetings that a team member attends each week is 5 meetings per week, which I don't think is overestimating things. It's probably more than that. But let's say that there are 5 meetings. So I'm being quite conservative here, but I just want to show you what this adds up to. And let's say that the average meetings are 2 hours. So basically people spend 10 hours or 25% of a 40-hour week in meetings. Now, I might say to you, and I've checked the data on this, that's pretty average. So spending about 25% of your time in meetings per week is quite the norm. So the average person spends 10 hours at $31.25 an hour. And let's say that you've got 6 people in your team. Of course, some of you have got less, some of you have got more, but let's just go with 6. And let's also, we're going to double the costs. And so, because of course, as I said before, there are opportunity costs. So if we consider, for example, that we have 6 people, that's going to cost on an annual basis your team $195,000 a year to attend meetings. Now, I don't know whether that shocks you or not, and of course, I'm not suggesting for a minute we shouldn't attend meetings. Of course we should. But the question is, are we getting $195,000 of value out of that is the key question. Now, if we work on the basis, and I am pretty confident that no one in this webinar is from an organisation that has 1,000 people, I might be wrong about that. But if we've got 1,000 people in a team, let's look at the figures now. It becomes rather interesting. Well, if we use the figures that I've just shared with you at the bottom, which, as I said before, are quite conservative, that is an annual cost for meetings across the organisation of $32.5 million. Now, for 1,000 people, you might say, well, that's a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean. But I guess if it was a line item in a budget, we'd all be looking at that line item, wouldn't we? And we'd be asking the question, are we getting value for this $32.5 million? So I just want to really say to you at the outset that meetings do cost a lot of money, and I hope that you get the idea that it does cost a lot of money, even if you consider the example on the right-hand side with 195,000 people. $195,000 for your team of 6. It's still a costly exercise. So, what I want to do now is talk about some of the things that I strongly recommend that you do or don't do in meetings, because, and some of you, I'm more than happy for you to disagree with any of this. So by all means, you know what to do. You can just type in a question or a comment, and I will certainly respond and address that. But my first point is that I don't think it's very wise to rotate the chair. I mean, it used to be quite fashionable a few years ago. Some of you may well be still doing it. But the reason I don't think it's terribly useful is that you are actually paid to run the meetings. If you're a supervisor or a team leader or a manager, you're paid to run those meetings. And that's what you should be doing, running those meetings. Also, the other thing about this, and I understand why people do it, because they want to get everybody involved and engaged in the meeting process. But let's face it, if you rotate the chair, the quality of the meeting's going to go down. That'll be the sacrifice. Because not everyone around the table will have good skills in running meetings. So it's likely that some of the meetings aren't going to go very well for you. And the other thing is that people absolutely dread the idea of chairing the meeting. So they're not terribly engaged at the idea of having to chair a meeting. So I don't think it really works very well on the engagement front. And I just think it's really wise for you to take that on and not delegate it. It's part of your core responsibilities, in my view. So the very first thing I'd suggest is not to rotate the chair. So I hope that makes sense for everybody. Another important point is that in the meetings you need to balance reporting and discussion. Now, I would suggest to you that most meetings there's a strong balance, or strong imbalance I should say, on reporting. So it's kind of like we go around the table, everybody shares the information or the report or the activity that they've been indulged in for the week or the fortnight, and we all share and pool that in the interest of communicating where people are up to. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute you shouldn't continue to do that. Of course you should. But if that's consuming the whole meeting, then I think you'll find that your meetings are pretty dull and boring. I'd suggest to you a good rule of thumb is 50% reporting and 50% discussion. So what do you discuss? Well, there's a whole lot of things to discuss. You can talk about problems that have arisen that need to be addressed. You can talk about customer feedback. You can talk about how the team itself is traveling as a team. You can get somebody in the team to give a presentation on a technical area that could enlighten and educate others around the table. There's a whole lot of things you can do, so you just have to get a little bit creative about that. And I'm going to share with you, of course, during this session, some things that you can do that will help you balance balance reporting and discussion in team meetings, and I think that becomes extremely important. So, likewise, if you just had meetings on discussion, that's probably an imbalance as well, because we need to know what people are doing. We need to give people an opportunity to share what they're doing and where they're up to and what their progress is. So 50-50 is my view. 50% reporting, 50% discussion is a good rule of thumb in my view for any team meeting. So for example, if your meetings run for an hour, 30 minutes on reporting, 30 minutes on discussion. Now, that might mean that what you've got to do as the team leader or the manager is you've got to sort of think about how people might prioritize their reports in such a way that it will minimize or reduce the amount of reporting so that you can create a space to have a good discussion around the table. Now, you, of course, you can email reporting. You can do some of that via email. You don't have to do that in a team meeting. So there's a little thought for you to think about how you might balance reporting and discussion. Now, the other thing that I think is extremely important, and when I talk about discussion, one of the things that is really useful in meetings is to use what I call critical incidents. Critical incidents are real life things that have occurred that you can use as an example to discuss with team members to clarify direction, explain your expectations, enlighten people, educate people, whatever it might be. So use critical incidents. Now, you don't have to embarrass people, of course, and if there's been an absolute disaster that's occurred and somebody, is seen to be the victim in this disaster, it's probably not a good idea, of course, to draw attention to it in that forum. But there are lots of things that can be discussed in meetings that should be discussed. And I always think it should be based on three key questions. What went well? So even if it was an absolute disaster, whatever it was, you ask the question, what actually went well? Because every single thing that occurs, there must be something, there must be a silver lining, there must be something positive that's occurred. So what went well? Okay, you really start with an upward spiral of positivity. regardless of how poor it might have been done. Then the second question is, what didn't go well? Now, you won't have any problem getting people to talk about that, because people are prone to be risk averse and to talk about the negative. So what didn't go well? Okay. Now, the third question that you ask about a critical incident is, what will we do differently as a result of this discussion? Which, of course, is the really important part of the looking at the critical incident. So what changes as a result of this discussion? Now, it might simply be that you continue to do what you're doing, or you all agree that that's the right way to do things. So the third question really does get a collective view around what we need to do as a result of this critical incident. All right, so use critical incidents, and if you're worried about what people might be thinking in terms of their own involvement, just start the meeting by saying to people that we don't want to talk about anyone in particular here. What we really want to talk about is the issue or the incident, and learn what we can from it. Okay, now that's the key thing, and if you can start the meeting that way, it's not about pointing fingers of blame or, why did you do such and such? That's not what critical incidents are about. Certainly you can address that in a one-on-one situation, in a conversation with the key person, absolutely. But in a meeting, it's more of a collective learning opportunity that you can use. All right, so that's consider using critical incidents. Now, the other thing about meetings that's very important is that you need to clarify what people's roles and responsibilities are. I am astounded at how little people know about other people around the table and what their particular role is in meetings. And of course, you as the leader probably do know everybody's role. I hope you do. And because of that, you're probably making an assumption that everybody else around the table is absolutely crystal clear about what everyone else's role is. Not so. So if you in complex environments, if you get people at different times and the appropriate times in meetings to share with other people around the table what their particular role is in the organisation, that would be a good thing. Now, they don't have to spend half an hour talking about that. They might spend 5 minutes just talking about the key priorities of their role. You're doing two very effective things there. One is you're forcing the person who's giving that short, sharp presentation an opportunity to be really crystal clear about what their key priorities are. And secondly, of course, you're giving everyone around the table an opportunity to consider what their particular role, or, what the other person's role is in that team. So, for a couple of minutes invested, that can get you a really good return. Now, you don't have to do everybody at once. You can do that perhaps once, one person at each particular meeting. Give people a chance to clarify what their roles and responsibilities are in a team situation. Now, I think, and I know some of you are working in outdoor environments, I think standing meetings are brilliant. And standing meetings are brilliant because when you have a standing meeting, what you're doing in effect is you are shortening the meeting considerably. So actually, by having everybody stand while you might have a quick briefing for the day's activities, say in a production area or whatever, you will find that you will shorten the meeting significantly. Why? Well, because not everyone wants to be standing around. And, so just having people standing means that people won't procrastinate. They'll get straight to it. So you can actually have a very effective 15-minute meeting standing up with your team members, and I would strongly recommend that you consider that if you haven't already or aren't already doing that. So that's great in outdoor type work, in situations where people have got to go somewhere, can be very, very effective. So think carefully about the use of standing meetings, and is it applicable in your work area? And if so, when would it be applicable, and how might you do that? Now, if a meeting is worth having, it's worth planning for. And I really think this is quite important. Now, if you have an impromptu meeting with somebody, obviously you don't have an agenda because it's impromptu. You've got an agenda in your head, but it's not a written agenda. So I'm talking about planned meetings here. So during a planned meeting exercise, make sure that you give the courtesy of everybody else by setting out clearly what you're covering in the meeting. Now, why is it courtesy? Well, you're asking people to give a chunk of their time to be sitting around, and I'm assuming that in this case it'll be sitting. They're sitting around giving a chunk of their time to this particular meeting. The least you can do is show these people that you've actually thought through and planned what's going to be discussed during the meeting. So it's fair and reasonable that you have an agenda. Now, it doesn't have to be a long agenda, just an agenda, and you wouldn't necessarily need to have the same agenda for every meeting because hopefully there'll be other things that are on the agenda. So the things that need to be discussed, remember the balance between reporting and discussion, those things should go on the agenda as well, so that basically everybody knows what's happening. And usually with an agenda, the best advice I can give you is the most important item goes at the top and the least important item goes to the bottom. So in other words, if you run out of time, it'll mean that you're running out of time on the least important things in the meeting, which means that that can carry over to the next meeting. So put the most important things first, right through the least important. And here's another little tip that works brilliantly, and I've used this in my own meetings and still do, and I find it's very effective. After each agenda item on the meeting agenda, put in brackets the time you expect to allocate to discussing that particular agenda item. Why? Well, it gives you this incredible authority to push people on. So you can actually say to people, look, we've only allocated 10 minutes to this item, so could you please be brief in your comments about this item? So it gives you that great moral authority to be able to do that without feeling as if you're imposing on people, or that people that you don't think their contribution is important, or at least they don't think their contribution is important. So put in brackets the amount of time for each agenda item. And then, of course, the second thing is try to stick to that time frame so that you aren't bogged down in a particular agenda item and never get around to resolving everything. So that becomes critically important. So have an agenda. It doesn't take long to put that together, and it'll make all the difference in the world of keeping you on track. Now, I think something that's often not done at the end of the meeting is to summarize what comes out of the meeting. Now, by this, I don't necessarily mean, minutes, although I think, again, if you go to have a meeting, it's worth recording what's being considered in the meeting, because otherwise things just get lost. You can't remember what you did on Monday, let alone last week, and it becomes a major issue. So I suggest this to you. Find somebody in your team who has got a good skill in being able to distill down and summarize key points. Ask them if they wouldn't mind summarizing the key points that have come out of the meeting. That gives them a job. It plays to their strengths. Everybody around the table benefits. Why? Because they've got somebody actually reiterating what the key outcomes of the meeting are. So you can't go wrong with that. And of course, if that person misses a key point, well, you're obviously chairing the meeting. You can also politely point out that there was something else that came up that probably needs to be considered as well. So it's good to have somebody to summarize. There's a third reason why that's really important. It means that everybody walks away from the meeting with a sense of achievement or accomplishment. In other words, they're very clear about what was achieved in the meeting because the person summarizing has really reiterated what the key points are. So that might be something. Now, you might say, well, shouldn't I do that as the team leader? Well, of course, you could if you want, but you've got enough to do by just running the meeting. So why don't you just delegate that to somebody? And not everybody's got an aptitude for summarising meetings. But you know yourself, there are some people who are very, very good at just being able to distill down the key points that have come out of a meeting. Ask them to do it. And I'm sure they'll be able to do it very well. Now, the other thing about meetings that are important is energy levels. Now, the truth of the matter is the energy levels of meetings drops off as long as the meeting goes on. So long meetings, there's an energy drain at the end. I am on a board for a university, and our meetings will probably go for about 3 hours. And I can assure you it's hard to concentrate for 3 hours. So towards the end of the meeting, energy levels drop off. So what that means essentially for you is that if you've got key decisions to make in a meeting, those decisions should be made at the beginning of the meeting when people's energy levels are high and they're, fresh and ready to go. So my suggestion is structure your agenda around decisions that have to be made early in the meeting. So for example, if you've got people going around the table reporting, I would probably suggest that you do that towards the end of the meeting. And if you've got a discussion item you want to talk about and make some collective decisions with your team, then do that early in the meeting. And that way, that's out of the way and you can move on to reporting later. Normally what happens is it's the other way around. People do their reports first, and by the time we get to the discussion item, people's energy levels are low, and often we don't give good we don't give enough time, devote enough time to the discussion. So that might be something to think about. I would suggest a good rule of thumb for meetings is to have hour-long meetings. Quite frankly, if you can't get everything done in an hour, it's a problem. So I think an hour is a good chunk of time, and you should be able to cram as many things as you can into that hour. And as I said before, there needs to be a balance between reporting and discussion. So think about the energy levels in a meeting and think about how you might be able to utilize the high energy levels early in the meeting to be making key decisions. Now, another thing might like to think about is how is the seating in your meetings? How do people sit during the meetings? Now, what I've shared with you on this screen, and I'm sure it'll come up soon. Let's just make sure it does come up. There it is. All right. So look, you have a range of options here. Now, I'll talk about the pros and the cons of each of these seating arrangements, because they're not all going to be suitable for meetings that you have. So if we go to the top left-hand side first, and let's go clockwise around and talk about each. The theatre style is where you've got people seated in rows, and you and perhaps some other people that are in the meeting will sit at a head table. So, when you look at a stock, if you look at a meeting for shareholders, you'll often find it set up this way where the people at the top table are the directors, and of course the shareholders are the people sitting in the audience. Now, this type of meeting is very good for reporting and for panel discussions. So at conferences you'll often find things set up that way. So it's great for getting a variety of opinions from the people at the top table. Works really well. The big downfall, of course, is that it's not conducive for conversation. It doesn't really provide a really open, collaborative environment because everyone's sitting in rows. It feels like a classroom. People might be reluctant to put up their hand and make a comment. Perhaps that's why they do that in shareholder meetings, probably to stop people making comments or making a fuss about the business and how it's operating. The next one, moving clockwise, is the classroom setup, where you have essentially people sitting behind tables, and I suppose you could argue the expert or the teacher would be sitting out the front or standing out the front. Very formal arrangement, and very good for when you are giving some instruction, and very much in a one-way format where everybody has to get the same information at the same time. The tables are great because people can write on them, but they're hopeless. It's a hopeless classroom setup is a hopeless setup for when you want open discussion in your teams, because again, people are hiding behind a desk, they're in rows, and you've got the expert out the front. So you'll find that in that forum, people are less likely to open up and discuss issues that happen to be on the agenda. The U-shape is a very popular format, particularly for training courses. I personally don't like it too much, but that's just my view. But the U-shape, at least with the U-shape, it's less formal than the classroom and the theatre style. And what it is, you've got, people facing each other on both sides. So it's a little bit more conducive to an open discussion. So that can be very, very useful if you're trying to open up a discussion. There's still a degree of formality about it, and that's perhaps why I don't like it. But I'm not suggesting it's not a good idea. And for large groups, beyond, say 10 people, it can be a very useful way of having a discussion where everybody is expected at some point to give their input. So that's the U-shape. Now, the cabaret style, which is down the bottom in the right-hand corner, is one of my favourites, because the cabaret style means that you've got people sitting around in teams, and you can still have a presenter out the front, but the presenter can stop at any particular time and ask each team in their groups to discuss whatever it is that you want them to discuss, so that people can go off and do that. So you could have virtually 4 teams in a room, or you could have cross-functional teams in the room where people are mixed up and working with different people. So cabaret style is, I think, very good when you've got a large group of people. Excuse me. The banquet style is a little more formal because you've got them in rows, and this can often be very good when you've got a formal after-dinner speaker, or you've got some dignitaries. Weddings are often set up, or a reception of a wedding is often set up this way, and that, of course, means that you're not expecting a lot of commentary from the floor, but it's set up in such a way so that people can share the situation with each other around the table, but still be listening to a particular presentation, speech, or whatever. And then, of course, you've got the conference setup on the left-hand side at the bottom. Now, the conference setup is a typical boardroom setup where everybody sits around a table, and probably likely that many of you would organise your meetings like that. So the advantage of that, of course, is everybody is facing each other, and I quite like that setup because everybody is facing everybody, and it gives people a chance to have a little bit more intimacy in terms of when they need to discuss things on the agenda. So I think it's a great setup. So you pick up your, I guess the disadvantage of it is it's quite formal, isn't it? And so people may feel a little bit intimidated in that sort of environment. So the idea is to select the one that best suits the circumstances of the meeting. So, if you've got to organise larger meetings, you might consider these 6 configurations and how you might use those configurations, depending, of course, on the purpose of a meeting. The more formal it is, the more you might consider theatre and classroom. The less formal it is, the more you might consider cabaret and conference. Okay. Now, One of the things that I strongly recommend you do, and I think it's one of the most underutilized things for meetings, and I'm talking about your meeting. What about inviting somebody to be a guest speaker? Now you might say, well, what's that all about? Why would I do that? Well, is there somebody in your team who could be your guest speaker? Now, guest speaker, I don't mean, give an hour-long presentation. It could be 5 minutes on a particular topic. I mentioned this earlier. So they might have a particular interest or a skill, or they've been to a conference and they can give a presentation. That would be a fantastic way for them to share their knowledge and for everyone else to benefit in a way. So how about you tap them on the shoulder and ask them if they're willing to present at the meeting? The other thing is you're going to get people from outside the team to come in and present. So perhaps you might get someone from HR, human resources, or someone from marketing. What are they doing in marketing? What are they doing in sales and customer service, for example? Why not get people along to talk about that? And that can be very interesting and useful. So use guest speakers, and as I said, we're not talking about hour-long presentations. Just 5 minutes here and there can be very, very powerful. Okay, so this will be coming up on your screen very soon. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to just talk, before we finish up, on a couple of things that can be very useful for you chairing the meeting. Paraphrasing is a great skill. Paraphrasing is when you've heard somebody say something in the meeting, as soon as they draw breath, you paraphrase. In other words, exactly what I'm doing. You say, so in other words, your main objection to this proposal is that we aren't consulting enough people widely enough. Or so in other words, you're confused about why we're doing this and what the prime objective is. Or in other words, you believe that this fits in very well with the strategic direction of the business. Whatever it is, you summarize in your own words what they're saying. Now, why would you do that? Well, 3 good reasons. First, as it says on the screen there, you're checking to make sure that you've got it right, because sometimes you haven't, and it's a good thing for you to check to make sure you've heard and understand what the person's actually getting to. Also, it lets the speaker know that you've heard them. Now, that's a good idea, isn't it? Let the speaker know that it's no good, they know for sure that that you've heard them if you can paraphrase what they've said in a few simple sentences. And I think the third important reason that's often underestimated is that you as the leader can move the conversation on. So basically you've punctuated their feedback by summarising it or paraphrasing it, and you're able then to move on in your agenda item to the next thing. So it's a good way of shutting up windbags in your meetings and be able to get them to get straight to the point. Because once you've summarised it, you can actually say, no, I don't need to hear any more. I've got it. I understand your point of view. And that's a legitimate way of being able to keep them quiet and move the conversation on to the next agenda item. All right. So getting people involved in meetings is critically important. And one of the best ways of doing that, in my view, is actually to ask people to contribute. Right? Now, the way to do this is that, somebody is sitting there very quietly in the, at the end of the table. They basically haven't said anything for the duration of the meeting, and you really desperately want them to say something. Well, what you do is you simply say to them in a nice way, Bill, is there anything you'd like to add that hasn't already been said? Now, Bill, of course, can say, no, I'm quite happy, thank you. But you, out of courtesy, have given Bill an opportunity to add, and sometimes, often, Bill will add something because you've asked him to add something. Or Mary, is there anything you can add to the conversation? That gives Mary an opportunity to consider what she might say, and sometimes she might take advantage of that. So that's a good way of getting people involved. You actually have to look at the person. Now, the good news is when you do that with one person, everyone else around the table knows that they could be called upon next to make a contribution. So it's not just Bill or Mary, it's everybody else around the table that actually realizes that you could call on them to make a contribution. So it works really effectively. All right. Now, if you want to set up, I won't spend much time on this because we're running short of time, but in one of my books, I talk about the team values charter, and you can set up a set of values in your team that is on how people. You'll be getting these slides, of course, as you always do, plus the recording, so you can actually think about this a bit further. But you ask essentially 4 questions to everyone on the team. Now, you have to answer this as well, but your first question is, what is the one value that's important to you and working with in this team? Now, you might say, well, we've got all these values around the place. This is a value for them working in the team that you happen to be leading. And then they might say respect. And your next question might be, what does it mean? What does respect mean? Because respect can mean different things to different people. Thirdly, you might ask, well, why is respect so important to you? And fourthly, what behaviours would demonstrate that value and what behaviours would violate that value? You actually get people literally to write down the answers to those questions and to read them out. You will be amazed at how effective that is. You just got to back yourself on this, and trust me, if you do this in your team, you'll get fantastic results. And of course, you record those values, and that happens to be your team charter, and that is the galvanizing set of values. And the reason it works, probably worked it out, is because everybody is giving an input, right? Nobody's left off the list, including you, and everybody has a say. All right, so that works really well. Another thing that works really well, and I'd strongly urge you to consider, to start each meeting you have with a win for the week. Now, what in heaven's name is a win for the week? Sounds like something motivational, doesn't it? Well, it probably is. You actually go around the table and you ask people to say something positive that's happened to them for the week. Now, if you meet weekly, it would be win for the week. If you meet fortnightly, it would be win for the fortnight. Now, it creates an upward spiral of positivity. It forces people to think about the positive things that have occurred during the week. And of course, there's a whole lot of very, very interesting information that comes out of those meetings. And some people will start talking about their home life, which is no drama, or their work life, it doesn't really matter. But win for the week is a fantastic way of starting a meeting. And it takes about 5 minutes around the table, and it can make a big difference. We're going to talk about the problems anyway, so why don't we start with the positives? And let's face it, there's got to be some wins for the week, surely. And you set the example by you starting, right? So you have to start by giving a win for the week, and then you just simply go around the table and ask everyone else to make a contribution. So that works really well. So guys, your homework is pretty obvious, I think, and that is, I want you to try some new approaches to your meetings. I want you to have a go at a few things. I want you to do things a bit differently. Mix it up a bit. Try some things. Not everything that I've talked about in this webinar is probably going to be applicable for you or your team, and some of it may be, but I'm sure there's one good idea that's come out that could make a huge difference to improving the quality of your meetings. You will find that your team members will appreciate it greatly if you're making an effort to have better, more engaging meetings. And that's the name of the game, isn't it, from the point of view of you as the leader. So I'd really urge you to do that. You're very quiet today, guys. Not much coming through on questions, but if you've got a comment or a question, now's your chance, because I'm just about done. I suppose that could mean that I've covered everything, but it may not. So if you've got questions, type them in and I'll deal with them. Now, just wanted to make a key point before we finish up. We have covered 6 particular areas, and I won't go through them all again, but you can see them on the right-hand side there. And I just want to give a quick plug to say that I have another series beginning on the 28th of this month, which isn't very far away, of course. In fact, it's Friday week. So I'm starting another Lunch and Learn, and it'll be exactly the same material. So if you've got other people that you think would benefit from this particular series, then could you please steer them in my direction, because I can enroll them in the next program. And I've actually improved the process. I'm now going to throw in one of my books as another value add to the workshops. So new series starts. If you've got people in your organization that would benefit, please send them my way. Shoot me an email. We can get them registered very quickly. I can send out an invoice and it's all done and dusted, but you'll have to move quickly. So guys, that's pretty much it. I think we're pretty much done, and I just want to thank you all very much for your involvement. It's been great. I've had a fantastic time presenting for you. I hope you've got something really useful out of it. Thank you, David. David just says a very valuable webinar series. Thank you, mate. I really appreciate that. And now the trick is, of course, to apply what you've learned. So I've really enjoyed it, and I will be sending you out the slides. I'll be sending you out the recording as well. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And as I said, if you've got anybody else that might benefit from this Lunch and Learn series, then if you could just get them to be in contact with me, or you can be in contact with me, whatever suits. So thank you, folks. I just got another bit of feedback here. Thank you, Tim, for a very good series. Thanks, John. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that feedback. And if you've got other feedback, you know where to get me on email. I'd be more than happy to take that on board. Thanks, guys. I wish you all the very best for the rest of the week, and have a great weekend. Thank you.